David Garrett.
Mr Chairman, thank you. Since we are debating this all as one question, my understanding is we can start at the beginning effectively and work through. Mr Chairman, I've read this bill with great interest, including the preamble, which, in my opinion, sir, illustrates a number of things. Firstly, it certainly educates those who don't know anything about the history of confiscation in the Waikato area. It also illustrates the dangers of omission. It also illustrates, Mr Chairman, how the Maori people are willing to play a very, very long game. I refer specifically to page 7 of the preamble, which sets out a series of what I understand to be correct historical facts about the invasion, and that's what it was, of the Waikato in the early 1860s, allegedly on the grounds that the Tainui were rebels. And I'll come to that in a moment. And page 6 and 7 set out a couple of major steps: the Crown military forces crossing the Mangatawhiri River in July 1863, the Crown occupying Ngaruawahia in December 1863, and the confiscation of lands that followed in 1865. And the preamble then goes on to say, correctly, that the Crown assumed control of and exercised jurisdiction of the river thereafter. But then over the page, Mr Chairman, it's very interesting. After a couple of paragraphs that don't say very much, we see this. In the changing legal and political landscape of New Zealand, Waikato-Tainui have always maintained the importance of their unique relationship with the river and the need to respect it, restore its well-being. Robert Te Kotahi Mahuta, who led the Kingitanga search for justice from the 1970s, etc., etc. So we've got a little jump there, Mr Chairman, from 1865, when there was widespread confiscations, not just in Waikato but elsewhere, to the 1970s. Now, that little section there omits some crucial parts of history. It is a myth that has been long promulgated, or used to be long promulgated, that Maori grievances about confiscation were dreamed up in the recent century. That is certainly not so. And my understanding from a study of history is that there were indeed complaints right from the beginning. And there was an assertion that land had been and resources, but particularly land, had been wrongfully confiscated in the 1860s. Mr Chairman, in the 1920s, omitted from the preamble here, at the urging, no doubt, of the Maori leaders of the day, an organisation or an inquiry called the Sim Commission was set up. And in 1928, it made a report, and it was quite startling. And it said this, that Waikato-Tainui were not rebels, one, their lands had been wrongfully confiscated from them, two, and there should be full and generous compensation forthwith. That report was issued in 1928, Mr Chairman, and for just under 20 years, and sadly that's been a history of these disputes in this country, for just over 20 years nothing happened. But then in the mid-1940s, again completely omitted from this potted history, the then matriarch of the Tainui tribe, Princess Tepuia, when asked to agree to conscription of Māori into the armed forces, refused unless the Raupatu confiscation grievance was addressed. And Mr Chairman, what happened in the 40s culminated in the Waikato-Maniapoto Maori Claims Settlement Act of 1946. And it's very interesting, Mr Chairman, it mentions the Sim Commission in its recommendations of 20 years before, and its title reads as follows: An Act to effect a final settlement of certain claims relating to the confiscation of Maori lands in the Waikato district and provide for the control and administration of the monies granted as compensation. The central provision of the Act is remarkable for its day and its clarity and lack of ambiguity. And it says this, Mr Chairman. Mr Chairman?
Go with Garrett.
In settlement of all claims and demands which have heretofore been made or which may hereafter be made upon His Majesty's Government in New Zealand in respect of or arising out of the confiscation of lands in the Waikato district, being the areas of land shown, etc., etc., there shall be paid to the Tainui Maori Trust Board the annual sum of £5,000 payable on the first day of April in each and every year, provided that there shall also be paid without further appropriation, as soon as practicable, the sum of £5,000 and the annual sum of £1,000. Now, Mr Chairman, in the early 90s, when the last settlement was made with Tainui, some people raised the 1946 Act and it was decried for three reasons. Firstly, supposedly these settlements were for derisory amounts. Well, Mr Chairman, I've done some research. £5,000 in 1946 was the value of a dairy farm. So today's $2-3 million. Let's be conservative and say it's $2 million. So we're not a derisory sum at all. Second, negotiated with the wrong people. Well, Mr Chairman, I've read the account by Michael King of the final settlement between Princess Tapuia and her lead advisors and Peter Fraser himself, the Prime Minister of the day. And I'm paraphrasing, not quoting directly, but the crucial chapter says something like this. When Tapuia heard Fraser's offer of £5,000 per year, she was so surprised that she urged X to his feet to accept before Fraser could change his mind. And I'm confident that that is a very accurate paraphrase. Now, Mr Chairman, where did I get that? I've said Michael King's Tapuia. Who pointed me in that direction? I'll tell you who, sir. The then lawyer for the Tainui. The then lawyer for the Tainui. And I said I wanted to get some balance on what was being argued at the time. And she said, go and get this book, read it. That's the best account there is. And when I did, I thought she can't have remembered what's in it. Because it was quite clear, sir, that the deal was settled back then. The third ground is that that supposedly derisory amount of $3 million a year was eroded by inflation. Certainly it was, sir. But everyone was affected by inflation in the years from 1946 to 1990. If one retired in 1970 on a handsome pension of $65 a week, by 1975 you were in major trouble because of 5 years of 18% inflation. Inflation affected everyone. It's become a bit of an old cliche that I sold my first house for $18,000. It was sold the other day for $360,000. I'm not entitled to go and get the money back. Now, Mr Chairman, coming back to the bill, there is talk that in the 1990 settlement the river was reserved. Well, I've read the 1946 Act word for word this morning very carefully. There's absolutely no mention of the river at all. I'm not going to repeat that section, but a full and final settlement of grievances. Now, the claim in this bill that we're talking about today is that, back in the 90s it was all reserved. The river was reserved. And it probably was, sir, because it's a very long game. And that is why this DRIP, the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which has been sanguinely declared on this side of the House to be meaningless and of no effect, we don't have to worry about it. They said similar things, sir, in the 1980s. The illustrious former Prime Minister and premier lawyer of the country, Sir Geoffrey Palmer, said about Section 9 of the State-Owned Enterprises Act, this is meaningless window dressing. Sir Roger Douglas was in Cabinet at the time. Meaningless window dressing to keep the Maoris happy. That's what Sir Geoffrey Palmer said, and it won't have any effect. And 25 years later, we are still debating, still having court cases about what that means. That led directly, sir, to the principles of the treaty which was dreamed up across the road by the late Sir Robin Cook and others on the bench. And they said, well, Parliament must have meant something, can't have meant nothing, and they haven't said what the principles are, so we'll make some up. That's effectively what they did, sir. And so, yes, you've gone very noisy. I see you were quite early on, though, Mr Horomia. When I was recounting the early bit, the stuff that you didn't disagree with, that didn't hurt you, you didn't say a word. But now you're getting very noisy. So, sir, This bill is a very dangerous bill. This National Party has said, oh, it's a one-off.